Don Markle, who's a both a wonderful writer and thinker about history, but also a man who has lived a life of service to the country and intelligence. And really looking forward to his comments. I'll be followed by a panel with Ralph Hauenstein, Don, Bill Brands, and Gleaves Whitney. I want to take just a second and thank Bob and Jane Becker. This is a magnificent club, and we appreciate you welcoming us here. This is just tremendous, so thank you very much. For purposes of introduction, I will introduce Ralph Hauenstein, who will introduce Don. Many of you know this, but I'm going to assume a few of you don't. Ralph was a city editor for the Grand Rapids Herald, then went off to work in intelligence in the Second World War and had a very distinguished career involved in information, maybe in disinformation. I don't know if you got all the way to that step as well, but certainly in the information part, and served in Europe and spent time with Eisenhower, our topic of the day. We had a chance to have one of the very few actual extant copies of the Declaration of Independence came to the Grand Valley campus. And Ralph and Stuart Padnos came out and offered some thoughts. And at the time, Ralph described what it was like to be one of the first Americans to enter the liberated concentration camps of Europe. And it was both it was obviously sobering, but it was also a heartwarming reminder of how courageous and noble the endeavor was of the liberation of Europe. After the war, Ralph had a very successful career in business and has used his leadership and his commitment to community and the resources that he earned in that successful business career in a number of ways to help West Michigan, the Van Andel Institute, St. Mary's, Grand Valley, and many others. And Ralph, we thank you for your support and we welcome you up.
Thank you, Mark. I was supposed to give just a short introduction to the next speaker, but I think I'll wing a couple of marks of my. First, I'd like to say that I thank Bill very much for your presentation this morning. But it was excellent, really. I would like to make one comment, though, that you had mentioned that you asked your class if they'd like to be the future presidents of the United States, and no one wanted to be, apparently, or at least very few did. It would be my hope that since we have the study of leadership and presidential studies, that when we get through with some of our classes at Grand Valley, we'll have a lot of people who want to be president of the United States. I think it's a very courageous thing that Mark and the faculty are doing here to put this program into force. We're going to study leadership. We're going to study the presidents, what makes good presidents, what brings prosperity to our country, what gets us into wars, keeps us out of conflicts, and do a general study so that we can have great leaders coming out of Grand Valley State University. I want to thank those who are participating in it. I think Pat Oles started this off and helped us a lot besides Mark. Now we have Gleaves, who I'm sure is going to be a very, very great help to us. He's already made notable strides, and I'm very pleased with things. My wife and I are just overpleased and overjoyed with what we see happening here. Now I'll get on to the next speaker, and I'll give a very short summary, as I was asked to do. Don Markle is a man who spent 30 years in the service of his country. He was a cryptographer, spent 13 years of it overseas. For those of you who don't know what cryptographer is, he decoded the messages, and something people call him a spy. I think he's a spy today, but I can assure you, I know spies, and he's not a runner. He couldn't spy. He couldn't make it. In any event, Don has done a lot of work for his government, worked for many, many years, and as I say, spent 13 years overseas doing this work in addition to being in Washington. He is a man who is now retired, but he spends a great deal of his time in lectures. He's been to the Smithsonian Institute just recently and lectures a great deal over the country. He's written some books, a couple of them, as a matter of fact, Spies and Spy Masters of the Civil War, and he just finished another one, The Telegraph in the War, both of which have been nominated for the Lincoln Prize. He is now living in Gettysburg with his wife, Jerry. He's retired, but he spends a bit of a time being a docent for the Eisenhower place that they have down in Gettysburg. I think it's known as the historic site, the Eisenhower Historic Site. So he's really very well informed about Eisenhower and other presidents, but a good man, a good speaker, a writer, a talker, and spy. Don?
Let me get my notes in the ground here. I could start by saying I work well undercover. First of all, let me say it's great to be here and be part of this day and to be able to talk to you about my neighbor, Dwight Eisenhower, because we live near his farm. And I do work out at the Eisenhower farm. I dose them out there, so if any of you come to Gettysburg, you have an open invitation to a private visit at the Gettysburg farm. After my talk, the four of us are going to be up here, and you can field questions, throw them at us at that time. And I want to talk about Ike, and I call him Ike. And by the way, all 6 Eisenhower sons were Ike. There was Big Ike, there was Little Ike, there was Ike the Third. Dwight is the only one who carried that name into manhood. And just to tie in a little bit what Bill was saying this morning about the presidents and generals, if you want to have an interesting time sometime, look at the life of Ulysses S. Grant and look at the life of Dwight D. Eisenhower. And you will find amazing connections between the two of them. They both were born in the Midwest. They both went to West Point to get an education. They both changed their names, went to West Point. It's not Dwight David Eisenhower, it's David Dwight. He turned it around when he went to West Point. So all through their lives, there are strong similarities between the two. I could have gone into a litany about Ike and talk about what he did and all that, but I don't want to do that. I want to look at Ike, the man, and try to understand his leadership during his presidency and what he faced. Let me start with one important aspect. And I think Bill brought this out this morning, but let me just say it again. One of the important things about the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, he did not need to make his mark in American history by his time as president. His place in history was established because of his actions in World War II. That gives him a real liberty. You're not focusing so much on my legacy. It's already there. It was firmly in place there. Spring of 1952, the race to become the Republican candidate was narrowing down. And there were only 2 candidates, basically. One was Robert A. Taft, as he said this morning, the old guard Republican, very conservative, an isolationist. And the other one was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And as Bill said this morning, Ike got into the race because of that rally at Madison Square Garden, which I think the fun part of that is that Bill didn't tell you, is that that rally was Act Two. There had been a World Championship basketball game there that night, and they kept everybody there, and they had the rally, and they didn't tell Ike when they went to show him the film that there had been a rally there first, okay? Politics at work. And also Ike said, you know, we can't be an isolationist anymore. And thirdly, he had a real concern that if another Republican lost, the two-party system in this country was in deep trouble. So he was going to run. He was new to national politics and the Republican Party. He had never voted in a national election. He had never assigned himself to a political party. Goes back to what Bill said this morning. Military and politics do not mix. So here he is, going to be president of the United States, going to run for it, never voted in an election, never was a member of a political party. Ike followed the West Point tradition, they don't mix. In fact, in a wartime letter to Mamie, he wrote, I laughed when I saw a statement in the newspaper that you could not inform a reporter as to which political party I belong. Neither could I. Okay? But was he a politician? When once asked about his political skills, he responded, quote, what the hell are you talking about? I've been in politics, the most active sort of politics, most of my adult life. There's no more active political organization in the world than the armed services of the United States. As a matter of fact, I think I'm a better politician than most so-called politicians. Why? Well, because I don't get emotionally involved, I can accept the fact for what it is, and I can accept the fact that when you're hopelessly outgunned and outmanned, you don't go and pick a fight. Think about some of this here. Not that all the presidential politics were alien to him, because as early as 1945 there were committees for Ike for president, way back then. And then, as Bill alluded to, in August of 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, President Truman said to Ike, quote, there is nothing that you may want that I cannot try and help you get, and that definitely and specifically includes the presidency in 1948. So he's being courted by both sides. However, in 1952, until that time, he remained committed to the military. As you know, he left Europe, he came back, he became Chief of Staff of the Army. A terrible job. But it helped him with the presidency, because what were you doing in 1945 and 1948? What did we do after every war? We downsize. And so he is struggling with Congress as to how much military we need, how much of a budget we need, and then on top of that, Truman comes to him and he says, Ike, you will integrate the United States Army, like that. And Ike says, you can't do that, because you have the black people over here, they have no training. You have the white troops over here, they have the training. You put them together, who are you going to promote? These guys are going to come up. You need to do it slowly. Truman says, nope, do it now. So he's fighting this. Then he becomes president of Columbia University. And what a lot of people don't realize, while he's president of Columbia University, Truman reorganizes the Department of Defense and sets up the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Ike becomes the first unofficial chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So 3 days he's at Columbia, 3 days he's in Washington, running back and forth here. And finally, he becomes the commander of NATO. He loved that job. And what you want to think about here is one of the things he's hit with. NATO is for the Western European countries to come together. 1950, 49, 50, war wounds are still pretty fresh. So what's the big question that hits NATO right off the bat? What do we do about Germany? What do we do about Germany? And so he personally went to all the heads of states in Western Europe and convinced them that you have to have West Germany as part of NATO. That was his own personal doing, getting them in there. The new Republican gets the nomination, and he may have carried off the convention, but he was to have a pretty rocky time with the traditional Republicans. As Bill said, he was not part of the old establishment, and he didn't like politicians, secondly. And his campaign for the presidency was based on three major themes. First one, the danger of power centralized in the federal government. He felt that the states should have their share. Second, the debilitating influence of the government domination of the economy. And third, the U.S. inadequate response to communism. Those were his main platform planks. He did not advocate the dismantling of the complex social welfare measures from the New Deal. And unlike a lot of current politicians, he did not promise a tax cut. Okay? At this point, I think it's important to mention one of his big campaign assets. And that was a woman by the name of Mamie. Mamie took to the campaign trail with gusto. And she was always one of the highlights of every stop he made. The Americans loved Mamie. And I think Mamie gets some bad raps along the way. I lived in Washington, D.C. during the war years, and Mrs. Eisenhower was there. And Mrs. Eisenhower could have been, I'm Mrs. Eisenhower, right? Big shot around town. You never heard of her. Very low profile during the war years. So she was a very important part of this. Once elected, 442 votes for him to 89 for Stevenson, Ike began to reflect on a new administration. And here's some really stark realities hit him. First, from 1931 to 1947, and again from 1948 to 1952, both the House and the Senate had been under Democratic control. Second, there would be only two, count them, two Republican senators in his new administration who had ever served under a Republican president. You think about that. They were Senator George of Georgia and Senator Carl Hayden from Arizona. And there were only 16 members of the House of Representatives who had ever served under a Republican president. Most notably, Joe Martin from Massachusetts. So he's got a real change here. That required a change. He was able to, what you need to do, he had to get these legislatures to stop thinking reactive and think active. A real switch going on here. Secondly, he was aware that the general feeling in the country was that the last Republican president, Herbert Hoover, or Heber Hoover as some people say, was responsible for the Great Depression. That tainted any future economic initiatives the Republican administration might think about doing. Third, Ike understood that since 1929, this country had been on a roller coaster ride. Think about it, 1929, the Great Depression. You start coming out of the Great Depression, we get to World War II. World War II's up, we come down, coming down to a peaceful level, we get the Korean War. So it's been this. And he is going to make a determined effort to make it this. Level it out. Level it out. And all of us remember the 1950s. They were good years. They were good years. Fourth, he knew he had to redirect the vision of America. The isolationist days were over. America was now a major player on the world stage. America had to have a double vision for the future, both national and international, not one or the other. It had to do both of them. And finally, had a cabinet to select. And since the Republicans had been out of office for 20 years, there were many, many politicians waiting to be tapped for a national level position. Our new Republican, however, chose a cabinet made almost exclusively of businessmen. The only career Republican who he picked in his cabinet was the man he made Postmaster General, Summerfield. That's it. That's it. His philosophy on the two roles of the presidency and the President of the United States is very unique. It has two roles. He is, first of all, he's the head of state. He's also the prime minister. Very unique in that sense. He understood very well that as the head of state, he's very public. But as the prime minister, as the head, the man who runs the country, he felt that there needed to be an air of mystique regarding the actions of the president. If the public knew too much about what he was doing or thinking, it hampered his movements. I'm not going to tell him everything. He much preferred what came to be known as the hidden hand presidency. And some examples of that. After the first election, now you have Republican, both House and Senate, by a very slim majority, but you've got them. He held weekly meetings with the members of the Senate and the House on the Republican side, and he stressed the new role of the party. Action, not reaction. In the first one of these meetings, he came out, he was thoroughly disgusted because he said, quote, he found habitual, almost instinctive opposition to the chief executive. Because that's what they've been doing for all those years. Retool, had to retool. In order to work more effectively with Congress, he recruited Jerry Persons, who had served as his congressional liaison officer for the Army. This proved to be one of the most effective liaison teams to function in the White House with or without a majority. Now, part of this goes back to his years when he's Chief of Staff of the Army. He is constantly up on Capitol Hill defending budgets. What are we doing? So he had an insight into that, and this Jerry Persons worked very effectively with that. He used his cabinet as a board of directors. They were not to come to cabinet meetings to report on their departments. This was not show and tell time. They were there to listen to a problem presented to him, and they would give their views to Ike. He would then digest all comments and make a decision. His cabinet secretary, Maxwell Rabb, excuse me, whom I served under when he later became ambassador to Rome, would set the agenda and task the various secretaries for input. And while his political skills for working within the system were well honed from his military days, his political awareness of his role as head of the Republican Party was not. He did little to assist in the 1954 midterm elections, and they lost the majority of both House and the Senate in that election. Excuse me. That, you think, what does that mean? That means you have no committee chairman. You've lost the committee chairmanships. So you've got a whole different world to work with. After that, he worked with Sam Rayburn and LBJ. And Ike, not a politician? Well, LBJ was giving him a particularly hard time when he was coming up for re-election. And so Ike calls his friend Sid Richardson, first owner of the Dallas Cowboys, a very wealthy Texan. And he says to Sid, Sid, you're a big backer of LBJ's. I want you to call him and tell him that unless he falls in line on this particular piece of legislation, you will put your money behind the opposition candidate. And LBJ suddenly decided he'd fall in line. Okay? In addition, one of his self-stated regrets was that he did not groom a Republican candidate to replace him as president. He didn't do that. Two of the major domestic issues that faced Ike were first McCarthy and secondly the school integration. In both cases, Ike's handling of the situation was based on his bedrock belief that the Constitution clearly predicated separation of the three major elements of government: legislative, judicial, and executive. And I know you all read the Constitution every week, right? Look at it sometime. Just read it. If you look at the Supreme Court, there are pages duties of the Supreme Court. You look at the legislature, pages. You look at the President of the United States, 2 sentences. That's it, basically. That's his function. Treaties, period. So it's an interesting concept here. In the case of McCarthy, it was his position, thank you, that the Constitution gave the Senate the only power to censure a sitting senator, not the head of his political party or not the President of the United States. He took a long time to get that done. And to show you how strong a lot of the Republicans were, Senator Dirksen, famous senator from Illinois, in fact voted against censure of McCarthy. In the case of the school segregation, once the Supreme Court had handed down the decision in the Brown versus the School Board of Topeka, it was his duty to implement the required actions. He was not about to violate the Constitution. However, he felt the Supreme Court had overextended their role when their decision in the school case dictated that integration be accomplished, quote, with all deliberate speed, end of quote. Their role, he felt, was to interpret the Constitution, not to implement the actions. On the general subject of civil rights, he felt strongly that the racial issue could best be solved starting at the local level and not by the government, as can be seen by his statement, quote, if we attempt merely by passing a lot of laws to force someone to like someone else, we're just going to get into trouble. He did, however, have the first African American ever to serve as an advisor in the White House. That was Frederick Murrow, who had been vice president of the Bank of America. His title was assistant to the president for special projects, not civil rights. Maxwell Rabb, the secretary to the cabinet, had the function of civil rights. Ike enjoyed a majority in the Senate and the House for only the first 2 years of his presidency. But the Democrats didn't prove to be his biggest problem. That was the traditional conservative Republicans who frequently voted against Ike throughout his 8 years in office. The middle of the road seemed to have a major bend in it, but Ike kept trying to pull him back into what he was doing here. On the international front, Ike had mixed results, as we know. His campaign promise of helping the Eastern European nations if they rose against the communists came to naught, as Bill said, when the Hungarian Revolution erupted. The free world had no way to assist the Hungarians. Austria, at the time, was a neutral country, and would not allow any equipment to go across there to Hungary. So there was no way they could help them. So that is one of the reasons we have so many Hungarian refugees in this country as a result of the revolution. It was our way of making a second guess on that. And while he proposed peaceful initiatives to the Soviet Union, such as the Open Skies Initiative and Atoms for Peace, he left office having not made major advances with the Soviets. One of the things he faces early in his administration with the Soviets is from the early days, right up through that time, there had been one Soviet leader, that was Stalin. Stalin dies during the Eisenhower administration. Nobody was quite sure who was going to take his place or what the transition was going to be. So there was a transition going on here. A lot of this was due to his U-2 incident, which set the Soviet-U.S. relations back. Those missions were all approved by him, and he did approve it. And where they got into trouble on this particular mission, just as an aside, the U-2 planes, if any of you have ever seen one, they're very fragile. They have a huge wingspan. The wings are so long that they have to prop them up or they'll sag because it's a light plane. When the pilot got into the cockpit, he was given a suicide kit, and the cockpit was locked. It would be unlocked when he landed at the other end. Now, Americans, we are so into human life. Look what we do when an American is kidnapped. We go through barrels. The British just say, he's yours. Take him. Nobody kidnaps a Britisher anymore, right? Okay. So We have this huge value in human life. So the Department of Defense and CIA get together and they unlock the cockpit. And they put an ejector seat in. And they don't tell Ike they've done it. So the U-2 goes down, and what does he think? The pilot's dead. Until 3 days later, then he finds out. So that was, and Ike had a temper, and he showed it very much that day. On a broader front, both Ike and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, I believe, had a very nearsighted view regarding the threat of expansion of communism. It was very easy to read national unrests as communistic, when in fact, some of them were purely nationalistic. Because remember, this is a time period that the colonial powers are leaving. They're withdrawing from Africa. They're withdrawing from various places in the world. And so there's this national feeling coming up. Now we have our own country. We're going to do what we want to do. And they misread some of that as communistic, when in fact, it was purely nationalistic. On the major international events that did occur, for instance, Comoy, Matsu, Lebanon, Suez Canal, Ike refused to raise the event to a level of a crisis. It was an event that needed immediate attention, but not a crisis. He was not going to start this again. He didn't want another roller coaster ride, and he reflected on his decision-making in a crisis by saying, quote, "This business of making decisions for America brings me strange experiences. I recall almost daily an observation attributed to Napoleon that went something like this. The genius in war is a man who can do the average thing when everybody else is growing hysterical or panicky in the excitement of the moment." And I think that's a very true statement. And that was Ike. He wasn't going to do that. So how did our new Republican do in the long run? Well, as Bill mentioned, there are surveys. A recent one of 78 scholars in history, political science, and law ranked Eisenhower as the 9th most effective president, between James Polk and Ronald Reagan. In addition, it is interesting to look at a recent list, which was titled "The Federal Government's Greatest Achievements of the 20th Century." Again, developed by scholars, and what it is, it's a list of what they consider were the 20th great achievements that the United States government has done in the 20th century. Ike contributed significantly to 8 of them. The number one thing on that list is the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. Now, he certainly did that. He won the war. He started NATO. And what a lot of people don't realize is Ike is the man behind the European Economic Community. He is the man who went to all these governments and said, you guys, you've got this going now in NATO. You need to get an economic community going. In fact, in 1955, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, Ike is the only non-European who's invited to that treaty signing. He's not there, but he's the man who got that started here. The 7th thing, strengthen the nation's highway system. What did he do? What do you see? You see it on the highways all the time. He started the interstate highway system. Now that comes about because he knew we needed, that's in his military thinking here. He saw the Autobahns in Germany. And he came home, we need to do that. Got to move military equipment as well as people coming to Naples and back and forth. You need more of them down here, I will tell you. But you got to move equipment, that sort of thing, so he built the highway system. What started all that? Right after World War I, Washington, D.C. decides, hey, we have to see if this will work, if we can move equipment from Washington to San Francisco. And so Ike takes a truck caravan, and they go cross country. Now, you all know the Lincoln Highway. Well, I have pictures of the Lincoln Highway. It's a mud road. It took him 68 days to get across. Okay? So this is in his mind. Then he sees the here. So here we go. Now, one of the interesting things about the interstate highway system is that every 5 miles there has to be 1 mile flat for planes to land. So it has there's a military side to all of this, okay? The ninth thing that happens, he reduced the federal deficit. Appropriate today. The 10th thing is, as Bill was said, promoted financial security and retirement. He expanded Social Security to include self-employed nurses, doctors, lawyers, and the military was put under Social Security at this point in time. The 12th thing, supported Veterans Adjustment and Training, the GI Bill. We all know what the GI Bill did for this country. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened. It got a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't get a college education, elevated them. 13th thing, promote scientific and technological research. He established the National Aeronautics and Space Agency that replaced the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics that had been established in 1915. He contained communism. No doubt about that one. He did. And the 17th thing, he strengthened the national defense. Always trying to keep it within balance. Always trying to keep it within balance here. When we talk about national defense, just let me add one little thing here. You remember what is the big campaign issue from Kennedy? The missile gap? It didn't exist. It didn't exist. Kennedy knew it. Eisenhower knew it. Eisenhower could say nothing because we knew it only through very classified sources. And so he was totally out of it. He couldn't say anything about this. But it really did not exist. I'm one of the people who thinks that a sitting president should never get into a debate because he can't say anything. His hands are tied. His hands are tied. He never wavered from his new Republican philosophy, and over time his fellow party members began to embrace some of his ideas and what he wanted to do. And whether or not you may think of him as a great president, I believe he definitely was the right man for the job at that particular moment in our history. We all remember the 50s as good years, despite the ever-present threat of a nuclear war. And I'd like to just end with one of Ike's quotes, which I find to be very interesting. It's kind of a combination of his military and his presidential years. Quote, "The nakedness of the battlefield when the soldier is all alone in the smoke and the clamor and the terror of war is comparable to the loneliness at times of the president." And I think our new Republican led our country very well. Thank you. Any questions? Are we all coming up here now, or?
You want to field a question?
Any questions? Yes, sir.
How did his two heart attacks in office affect his whole thinking and his ability to exercise?
I don't think they affected him at all. The question was, well, how did his two heart attacks? He actually had 5 heart attacks. The first heart attack, as you know, was right before he was going to run the second time. And there was a big question, is he going to run or is he not going to run? And Mamie went to see the famous heart surgeon in Boston. Was it Dexter White? No. Anyway, famous heart surgeon in Boston. And his comment to her was, "I think you better let him run because if you don't, you're going to kill him." And so he did run again. And he also had a slight stroke while he was in the White House. But he was a very strong, he was a very fit man. He was physically a very strong man, had been a football player at West Point, would have been an All-American, but he hurt his knee. And so I think he was able to handle that. It was his last heart attack that killed him at Walter. He spent the last year of his life at Walter Reed, not up at the farm. Any others? Yes, sir.
How good was his golf game?
You know, when he played golf in Gettysburg, it was state and national secret. He at his peak, had a 5 handicap. Yeah. Yeah. Any others? The scenes you see of him, and it plays into this. The scene, please, when you see him behind the White House where he had his putting green and he's out there putting, some of that's deliberate. Some of that is for his own relaxation, but some of that was done to say to the country, hey, everything's okay. Everything's okay. I'm going to go out and putt a little, so just relax. We're okay. So I think that was some part of this too. Mamie played a big part in his life, and her rules of the game were, and you see this when you're at the farm, when you come home at night and you cross that threshold, do not think you bring one piece of work home with you. You may be the commander-in-chief out there, but here, I am the commander-in-chief. And he really lived by that. He lived by that. Any others? Yes?
You talked about Mamie and how wonderful she is. What about his affairs during the Second World War?
What affairs? Okay, I may take care of this now. Ralph, told you, Ralph. I told you it was going to come up. Everybody talks about Kay Summersby and the possibility of his affair. And I don't. Do you want me to steal your thunder, Ralph? According to that man sitting right over there, every American officer in London of any stature had a driver. They were all British. And according to some gentleman who's sitting right over there, the higher the rank you were, the more beautiful the girl got. So Ralph said his was pretty ugly. Okay? Kay Summersby was a very beautiful woman, very talented. And according to, again, somebody I know, obviously a member of British intelligence. When you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. They're driving him around. He's got American officers in the back. She listens to what they're saying, can turn it in here. I think whether he had the affair or not, I personally do not think so, because if you read his letters home to Mamie, I don't look at Ike as anything of a devious man. I don't see that in him. And his letters to Mamie are very direct and very, very personal. I think where he made his mistake, Ike loved to go visit the troops. And he thought nothing of saying to Kay, get the car and let's go. And the two of them would go off by themselves. So you don't know what happened. Kay came to this country, and in New York City one night at a dinner, she's sitting next to Mrs. Bob Considine. And Mrs. Considine looks over and he says, hey, Kay, did you ever sleep with Ike? And Kay says, you are the first person who's ever had nerve enough to ask me that. And the answer is no. I would have if he had asked me to, and he never asked. So, it'll never die. You'll never know. It'll never die. It'll never die. Any others? Yes, sir.
Did he have any feelings about the execution of the private?
Oh, private, yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel about that first thing?
He was for it. He signed off on it.
Deserted, wasn't
Yeah, deserter. Slovak. He signed off on that. Yeah, and that would be the military in him. That would be the military in him. It was a problem they were having over there, and you got to solve it, so you're going to do it. Yeah. Yeah, just like the Rosenbergs. Am I taking too much time? Ike becomes president of the United States. And one of the first things that plops on his desk is the Rosenbergs. They've been through 19 appeals. They've lost every appeal. And so it's up to Ike. Do I execute one? Do I execute two? What do I do? What do I do here? And what happens here is he is shown my old agency during the war years was intercepting the KGB traffic going out of the embassy in Washington, D.C. And they were able to read that. And in that traffic are both Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Both of them are in that traffic. And so based upon that, Ike says, okay, we will execute the two of them for that reason. Now, we know one of the nuclear scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project who will tell you that the Rosenbergs advanced the Soviet nuclear research by 5 to 6 years. So it wasn't a small thing. Now, when he made that decision, all that traffic was not public knowledge. That only became public knowledge in the last 5 years. But he saw it. Now, that file wasn't even used in the court case. It was only for them. Okay? Any others?
Thank you very much, Don. That was a very insightful talk on Eisenhower from somebody who has a lot of that inside information. I saw a lot of people nodding their heads when the discussion of the U-2 came up, for example. So I thought that was very insightful. We'd now like to invite the rest of our panelists, people who have appeared earlier in the day and need no introduction, to take their places up here at the table. The steps are on the other side there. And you want to go this way? Yeah. Okay. And we will field your questions. I know there are a lot more questions, and it's an open forum, so any questions you have, put to any member or to all of us if you wish, if you have questions for us at this time. And we will go until 2 o'clock?
Yes.
5 till 2. So we have about 15, 20 minutes. There's a question right there.
For Bill Brennan, what created the hostility towards Truman at the end of his term?
One of the reasons Truman was so unpopular during the end of his, well, first full term, really, effectively second term, was that the Cold War was turning in a bad direction for the United States and Asia, particularly. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War there. And so the world's most populous nation had fallen into the communist camp. Shortly thereafter, the Korean War broke out. Now, initially this went well for the United States. At least the United States was able to stem the communist advance in Korea. And Truman ordered General MacArthur to push north into the northern part of Korea, which brought the Chinese into the war. So at that point, it looked as though this policy of containing communism, to many people anyway, was failing. It was failing to take full notice of the aggressive nature of communism. That was part of it. A lot of it had to do, though, with simply domestic American politics. Truman, against all expectations and odds, had won a very close race in 1948. The Republicans, in fact, in the 1948 campaign, had adopted a rather high-minded and bipartisan approach, especially to foreign affairs. And they deliberately went out of their way not to challenge the Truman administration on foreign affairs, in part because they thought it might alienate Americans, in part because they figured that they would probably, very shortly, inherit those policies and probably have to deal with them. When Truman surprisingly won, then many of the Republican leaders decided, well, this nice guy stuff simply doesn't work, and we're going to go at the Democrats hammer and tongs. And so between the domestic politics and of course, the Cold War, Truman found himself very unpopular by 1951.
Another question? Yes, President Murray.
We have a fairly timely issue here about intelligence and incomplete intelligence, and how does the president make a decision given that they have a book of intelligence from it and may or may not be fully accurate, and they have political issues and military issues. Our two people have been engaged in military intelligence. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that in the context of what's currently going on.
Go ahead, Ron. Play with it.
Well, I wasn't sitting next to the president, but I happen to know that he gets his briefings every morning from the security heads of all departments, particularly the CIA chief, briefs him every morning. Tom Wolsey was the chief of the CIA for some period of years, but he had a hard time with Clinton. I just tell you this little story because every other CIA chief has been able to go into the president and give him morning reports, and Clinton didn't want the morning reports. He didn't care about them. But every morning he gets the fullest reports from all the security agencies are condensed into one report for him every morning. Do you want to know what the reports are? I could give you some time about the wartime intelligence reports and so forth. In the war, we had various types of intelligence, of course. Many of you have been in the service, you probably know it. We had restricted, confidential, we had secret, top secret, most secret. Then we finally had what was known as ultra. It was the top of all intelligence. It was the decoding of the German messages, and we knew virtually every move of importance that the Germans were going to make and when they were going to make them. At times we even knew sometimes Hitler would give orders to his generals, and we often had that report before the generals got it. This was one of the great surprises for Eisenhower. We in America, of course, had not had such service as this before the war. Our intelligence was rather weak. We had ignored intelligence. But thanks to the British, really, who have been experts in intelligence work for centuries, we gained a great deal of intelligence, and we became as efficient as anyone else during the war. The only failure that we really had, I would say, in intelligence during the war was the time of the bulge. Apparently, Hitler had given the orders that no communications would be made by any methods whatsoever to the German forces to have this counterattack against us, which was fairly successful until Patton came along and knocked them out. But the intelligence was absolutely perfect during World War II, and we could not have succeeded the way we did without that form of intelligence. D-Day was the application of two forms of intelligence. One was the deceptive intelligence, by which we convinced the Germans the invasion, of course, was not going to be held where it took place. We absolutely convinced them there was going to be the Pas-de-Calais area, and we used a lot of methods. We had our secret agents who gave false reports. We had aerial photographs, and we had dummy armies by which Patton was supposed to be the commanding general of the great army that we had formed over in dummy form in the southeast part of England. It looked from aerial photographs, of course, as though we did have an army there. We had fake balloons, fake tanks, fake huts, fake everything. And we fed information to the Germans that we were going to come through Pas-de-Calais area. The reason for that was this. Hitler was convinced that in the war that the Allied forces would invade the Germans through Pas-de-Calais because it was the closest point between England and the continent of Europe. The Germans at that point put in the 15th Army, which was 19 divisions with 1,000 Panzer tanks. And the idea was that we had to keep those people in that area. If they ever got loose, we would have a failure in our success of the invasion. So we put out false reports. We had a wonderful agent by the name of Garbo who could give all types of, he was such a good agent, as a matter of fact, in giving false information, what we call double agents, that they were so proud of him that he gave him the Iron Cross in absentia. And we fed him terrible, terrible mistakes. But this was the type of intelligence that was carried on from that point on, all through the war, up until even the present day. We have these forms of intelligence that are carried on, and that's why I think Don was alluding to it here. It's to be a president and to know something, and to know that the public is being informed and believes other things, is a pretty hard task, because he's making decisions on one being based of what he actually knows is going to happen, but which the public thinks is something different. And it's a very difficult problem in some of these things. And they do have it at the White House today.
Not only did Garbo get the Iron Cross, he got the Order of the British Empire. So he got it from both sides in the same war. One of the things that's important to remember is the president gets what they call presidential briefs. He also gets presidential estimates, where they will come to him and say, an example today, what's the story with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And then they are supposed to come up with a presidential estimate, or an estimate of what is the current thinking in that area. When they do that, I think they're still doing it, I'm talking a few years out here, they will supposedly validate intelligence. If it's a category A, it's dead on. If it's a B, well, maybe if it's a C, and you go right, they go down through, I think it's E. So if you have something which is being reported as an E level, be careful. It's a thought kind of thing. And so that's what he has to go on. You also have a Presidential Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which is made up of people who are not necessarily in it anymore, but are highly qualified intelligence people, and they meet and they look at these estimates and so forth, and then they debate and come up with the ideas of what's going to happen or what they think is happening. Most people in the country unfortunately think that intelligence is an exact science, and it is not. It's a best estimate, and that's what it is. Okay? That help you?
Question here.
Mr. Howenstein, the fact that our President Bush is getting blamed for the lack of intelligence in Iraq, is that something that has happened in either prior administrations or administrations that caused this problem? Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah,
As I understood what you said, had the problems that current President George W. Bush had with intelligence concerning Iraq, does that have precedence in previous administrations that have caused problems?
No, what I'm asking is the fact that we did not have strong military leadership prior to President Bush caused the problem that he is now having.
Is the fact that the prior administration did not provide strong military leadership a cause for the problems we have today that George W. Bush has faced?
well, I don't think that the strength of the military had much to do with it, because I don't know that exactly all of the intelligence that was given its full interpretations, and I think that there's a large gap between what was intelligence and what is information in this particular instance. I think there's a great gap there, and it was never closed properly. And I think Bush went on what he believed was intelligence, and it probably was less intelligence than it was mere information. That's my opinion.
One of the other things that's happened in the Clinton administration, Congress passed laws. If you're going to try to recruit agents in another country to report to you, chances are some of them may not be upright citizens. Yeah, imagine that. Well, the Congress passed a law that said you couldn't recruit anybody that had a police record in his country. And that closes avenues for you. It just really does. It was pretty naive on their point to do that.
Question back here.
I would just like the group's opinion. If there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, why didn't they just let us come in and inspect instead? And they knew they couldn't win the war after the Gulf War, first Gulf War. And Saddam had an exit strategy to get out and get all this money ready to get out of Iraq. And why doesn't the administration make that logical argument? Maybe the weapons of mass destruction went to Syria or somewhere else. I'd just like an opinion.
Okay, thanks.
You want that one, Bill?
There are a couple of For instance, I think people in this country, we do not understand the Arab mind, first of all. They think so differently. If you listen closely to what Inspector Kay said when he came back, he makes the point that Saddam may have thought he had weapons of mass destruction because that's what his staff told him, and there may not have even been any there because they knew that's what he wanted to hear, and if you don't tell him what he want to hear, you're going to be out there in the desert somewhere. And I think it was a game he was playing. I thought he felt that if he played the game, it would go on forever, go for a very long time. And then when you talk about intelligence, it plays another thing, because you get defectors coming out. People come out. Some of them are going to tell you what they think you want to hear, whether it's real or not real. They're going to tell you that, and that's where you have to kind of sift through all this. I think he was just a big chess game. It was a big chess game for him, is what he was doing. Why was he doing it? That's the question. Nobody's really sure of that.
Bill?
I'll take a shot at it. I think part of it has to do with the fact that Saddam Hussein had himself fairly well insulated from the outside world. And so I don't think he had a good sense of American politics. I don't think he had a good idea of what the Bush administration was thinking. I think that he had much of the information that got filtered, and so he probably didn't have a very objective notion of what the Americans might do. But leaving that aside, he may well have decided fairly early on that this particular administration was going to attack Iraq. And if he had come to that conclusion fairly early, then he might well have decided that the only thing that was keeping the Americans at bay was the possibility that Iraq might use weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, for example, against American troops, or nuclear weapons even, say, against Israel. And so even if he didn't have them, it would make him appear a more formidable adversary if he pretended that he did. There's also the whole question of how can a closed society, how can a closed regime allow outside inspectors in? In 1948, at the time of the Marshall Plan, the U.S. State Department, the Truman administration, invited the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries to participate in the Marshall Plan. They did so hoping that Stalin would say no, because they knew perfectly well that Congress would never approve a financial aid package that would aid America's enemies. But they also had strong reason to believe that Stalin would say no, because part of the deal behind the Marshall Plan was there were going to be lots of American inspectors going to recipient countries to make sure the money was well spent. And they had every reason to believe that Stalin would never tolerate these inspectors. Now, they obviously weren't looking for weapons of mass destruction, but they would find all sorts of things that Stalin didn't want to reveal to his enemies, or perhaps even more importantly, to his own people. And I can certainly see a certain perverse logic behind Saddam resisting international full inspections, because it would reveal his regime to be much weaker than he wanted it to appear, not only to the outside world, but to Iraqis themselves. But, you know, who really knows what was going on in his head? I think we can guess, but that's about all.
Ralph, did you have a comment on that, on the weapons of mass destruction? Okay, well, I'm told by the timekeeper that we have to draw this very exciting day to a close. I want to thank all of my colleagues at Grand Valley who helped put on this wonderful day and help make the Hallenstein Center shine. You guys make me look great. And then I also want to thank the distinguished speakers that we had today, Ralph Hallenstein, Don Markle, Bill Brands. Thank you all for very stimulating comments, and thank you very much for coming.
And I also want to thank you all for being here and for the wonderful support in so many different ways that you've given to our great mission at Grand Valley State University. We enjoyed you being here. Thanks.
See you tonight, Gleaves.
Yeah, see you tonight.
You bet.
All right, thank you.
You bet.
Well, okay, thanks.